Hussein Aboubakr Mansour, and he's a senior fellow at the Jerusalem Center for Foreign Affairs. He's an author, and he specializes in Arab political and intellectual thought.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Raymond, and thank you very much for Coptic Solidarity for all the great work that you do. It's a great pleasure to be here. It'd be hard to speak now. Ambassador Fernandez practically took all my points. As Ambassador Fernandez has said, Middle Eastern Christians have been at the eye of every single storm that brewed in the Middle East, geopolitically, politically, domestic politics, regional politics, the rise of radicalism, Islamism, Arabization even prior to that. Middle Eastern Christians were dead center in the middle. All minorities, Jews have always also been at the middle of this. But Jews ended up getting their own state. Middle Eastern Christians and their societies are mostly vulnerable, and they are like hostage minorities. Every crisis in their societies, legitimacy crisis, they are some of the first people to pay for. Instability, the rise of terrorism, they're usually one of the very first groups to pay the price. And these dynamics are extremely complex. They are interactions between the populist forces, the hatred that sells very easily, state structures that often claim to themselves third worldist, leftist, progressive character, yet suffer from various crises, whether in terms of their own legitimacy internally or questions of identity. Geopolitical, regional ideologies, Islamism and Muslim Brotherhood, Khomeiniism, all of these forces interact together always to create terrible conditions. And I will actually focus on some of the recent examples of Egypt in order to demonstrate some of this. A few months ago, the Coptic inhabitants of rural villages in the south of Egypt woke up once again to a day of mayhem, chaos, and assault. Angry mobs attacking and torching various houses that belonged to the Coptic families after insidious rumors spread all over the area, claiming that the local Copts were committing a heinous crime. What was this rumored, unconscionable crime that called for such a visceral reaction from angry people? Were local Copts involved in some scheme to destroy a village, poison the wells? Did they abduct a Muslim child to use their blood for their Christmas or Easter cookies? No. It was that the local Copts were building or converting an already existing building into a church. They simply wanted to pray. This is a very common episode in Egyptian affairs. Nearly all of its details are now a staple periodic reoccurrence, a cycle in Egypt with an annual or biannual frequency, if not even more. So much so that one could, with remarkable accuracy, predict the next one. The formula is stable and simple. A local Coptic population increases in numbers and is in need of a place of worship to accommodate their increasing numbers. The Egyptian government, with its Byzantine bureaucracy, Ottoman attitude towards non-Muslim minorities, and structural discrimination against Christians, refuses to issue building permits, as Raymond mentioned. The local Coptic community then finds itself under the reality, under necessity. It finds no alternative but to improvise, utilizing one of their existing community buildings to change it to a place of prayer. Usually they utilize something that they've already built, maybe add to it. The local fanatics then notice, they stir up the local Muslim population, warn them that the Christians are building a secret church, then lead an angry mob with pitchforks and torches to wreak havoc. Days of anti-Coptic violence pass before the government intervenes. No investigations are conducted, no arrests are made, no guilty parties found. The government condemns both parties for their sectarianism, warns them of foreign conspiracies seeking to undermine national unities, and proceeds to celebrate its own tolerance and magnanimity, for which the Coptic community is asked to give testimony. And what starts as a tragedy ends as a spectacle. These details are familiar to every Egyptian in the room today. And they are practically Egyptian cliches at this point. So all the ills that underlie them are also accepted as a matter of brute fact. The blind anti-Christian fanaticism in society, the official marginalization, the structural discrimination of the state against Copts, and ambivalence, at best, towards their safety. Like many other non-Muslim minorities in the Middle East, the Copts fell in between the cracks of state sovereignty and the modern nation state. Modern states claim to have sovereignty over them, their history, their heritage, and their identity, yet seldom translate their sovereignty into equal citizenship, rights, or protection. So again, Copts and other non-Muslim minorities are right between the cracks of sovereignty and modern nation state in the Middle East. Modern states in the Middle East claim to have sovereignty over them, over their history, over their heritage, over their identity, yet seldom translate this sovereignty into equal citizenship, rights, or protection. Decades ago, radical Islamist factions recognized the vulnerabilities of Middle Eastern Christians and saw them as a strategic target to challenge the foundation of the modern nation state in the region. These extremists perceived Middle Eastern Christians as a weak point in the structure of contemporary Middle Eastern states, which profess universal sovereignty and protection over citizens regardless of religious affiliation, at least formally. In their campaign against secular governance, whatever that means in an Arab country, attacks on Christian communities like the Copts in Egypt were calculated by Islamists to provoke a response from the state. This strategy placed the state in a pernicious position. If it intervened to protect Christians, it risked inciting radical Muslim factions who could accuse the state of favoring Christians. Conversely, if the state failed to act, it would appear ineffectual and unable to fulfill its foundational claim of offering equal protections of all its citizens. Most importantly, such a challenge entailed a challenge to the state's identity itself. Most modern states in the Middle East insist on being modern nation states and being Muslim states. Targeting Christians, especially over the issue of the presence of churches with crosses on public display, puts the state in a symbolic corner. The state's response usually has been to have the cake and eat it too, letting the Christian victims be victimized, and afterwards making their bishops and priests go on live TV to thank the state for its loving embrace. This tactic by Islamic militants serves several purposes. It tests the state's legitimacy and sovereignty, exasperates sectarian divisions, and weakens the state's authority by showing its inability to protect all its citizens equally. While this method of targeting highlights the complex dynamics between religious minority rights and state sovereignty and the profound impact of extremist ideologies on the political stability and identity of nation-states in the Middle East, it also shows how the Copts have been helplessly caught in the middle of a fire of a regional civil war. Every single major wave of attacks against the Copts shows the structural relations between the Copts' safety and regional politics showdown with radical ideologies. The 1970s wave of Islamic revolutionary movements corresponded with one of the first major waves of attacks on the Copts in Egypt. 1990s waves of jihadism, you had the rise of jihadism in Algeria, there was a civil war in Egypt, it was a very difficult time, also corresponded with a wave of attacks on Copts. The 2000s, Second Intifada, the rise of international jihad. 2013, the anti-Muslim Brotherhood coup corresponded with massive attacks on Copts in Egypt. And now, what seems to be another radical wave tied to the regional tensions with the Iran-Gaza axis. The Copts then, and Middle Eastern Christians in general, find themselves in one of the least favorable places in the structure of Middle Eastern politics, the target of both Islamist fury and the state's quote-unquote loving embrace. How unfortunate is it to be the victim of both structural distortions and rogue agent actions, and of course, populist hatred. Our activist scholar class, I'm talking about ours here in the United States, that loves a good oppression story, must be all over this. One would think that such a tragedy made the Copts a prime interest, and Middle Eastern Christians a prime interest of Western academics, universities, human rights organizations, and international institutions that are obsessed with human rights, oppression, and the lack of rights in the Middle East, especially for minorities. Only that is not the case. Anyone familiar with the world of the Western Academy and scholarship in the matters of the Middle East knows that the Western Academy is single-mindedly obsessed with three issues only: the Palestinians versus Israeli occupation, Islamist electoral popularity versus the big bad pro-Western autocracies, and the never-drying imaginary well of the crimes of colonialism and imperialism in the Middle East. That's really what the Middle East studies in the West have come down to. The Copts, the Yazidis, the Chaldeans, the Maronites, the Kurds, the Assyrians, the countless other minorities do not matter enough for our self-appointed priesthood of human rights. May I suggest that the reason that these minorities do not matter for the global human rights industrial complex is because such a complex is already an agent present within the very structure of Middle Eastern politics that generates these outcomes? May I suggest that such an industrial complex has vested interests that lay in grieving how Arab autocrats oppress Islamists, but not on how both groups oppress non-Muslims and non-Arab minorities? This is the reason I'm happy we're here today. Egypt Copts are caught in a structure of powers that does not see them or their pains. Thus, bringing visibility, especially to policymakers and their staffers on this Hill, is of the utmost importance. The United States government remains Egypt's most important strategic ally and a provider of a substantial aid. It is imperative that this partnership be leveraged not only to advance geopolitical interests, of course Egypt matters now more than ever because of the Gaza situation, but also to ensure that the fundamental human rights principles are upheld. The plight of the Copts serves as a crucial test for the Egyptian government's commitment to these principles. President Sisi came after a very scarring year of a Muslim Brotherhood rule, a major crisis for Egyptian nationalism, Egyptian identity, the Egyptian modern state. And he came with a promise to restore the civility and the modern aspirations of the Egyptian national state. To uphold these commitments and to uphold these principles, his ability to enforce the rule of law equally for all Egypt's citizens is of the utmost importance. As members of the U.S. Congress, staff, and policymakers who are here in the Hill, they are uniquely positioned to influence the bilateral discussions and aid conditions that impact Egypt. By raising the issue of the Copts in these discussions, we can press the Egyptian authorities to take more decisive actions to protect this vulnerable community. This is not merely about advocacy for minority rights, it's about reinforcing the integrity of the nation-state model in the Middle East, which is predicated on the universality of citizenship and equality of all before law. Thank you very much. Thank you.